Hey, hi, good evening, everybody. How are you guys? I'm here calling from Savannah, Georgia. We're here right now at like 10 o'clock. I'm so happy that you guys are able to join us in this great circle. Um, Also, with our organization, I'm proud that I was able to meet Sarah and our board members, and they're so uh, motivated to do this and get our story out there that um, I'm just moved. Um, this journey has been something that was long coming for me. I'm a fifth generation of an enslaved of Z Quarterman. My mother is from Japan, so coming from Japan, being raised there from 12, not knowing anything about racism or anything, and coming here at 12 and learning the Deep South, how it was and how it changed me and how I am today is something that should be told, and more stories should be told. So I'm glad you're here with us. I'll be here the whole time, and let's have some fun and truth telling, and just get the uncomfortable questions out there also if you have it. Sarah?
Thank you, Randy. I'm going to be, I'm making sure as I talk a little bit to let people in as they come into the waiting room. So if my eyes dart around, that's what I'm doing. But welcome everyone to the first engagement event for our partners and their guests. I want to thank everyone so much for joining our Descendant Circle, or our partners in healing, or for paying redress toward Black communities in any way or in any amount. And mostly to thank you for being here and caring enough about the topic of reparations to come. I'm Sarah Eisner. I'm calling in from Atherton, California, or Ramaytush Ohlone land. And I'm Randy's co-founder. Um, it's just totally awe-inspiring and a dream come true to see so many of you here interested in both reparations and family history. And this workshop being about the two of those things is really near and dear to the Reparations Project's heart, because the reason that we are here doing this work together is because Randy and I were exploring our family histories. And my ancestor both enslaved Randy's ancestor and also paid reparations to him. And both of those things have inspired me to find what I think of as my life's work. And in going along this journey with Randy and deeper into both of our family histories. So this is also a big part of our ongoing work, and what we're committed to is encouraging other white people to understand their family histories. And I think, and that's related to whether or not you have any history of enslavement in your family. And I think Lottie's workshop will go a long way to explaining why that is. So let me introduce Lottie. I met Lottie through a wonderful organization called Coming to the Table that brings Black and white people to the table together, or in the last year to Zoom together, to talk and try to understand one another's stories and to act. And it was only about a week after I joined that people started saying, you gotta meet Lottie, you gotta meet Lottie. And immediately I knew she was an incredible force. So Lottie runs a website called Reparations for Slavery that also talks about much more than slavery and harm done to the present day. But she helps white people walk the path of racial healing and exploration to better understand our American history and our family histories and the nature of institutionalized racism and how all those puzzle pieces fit together. And she also encourages white folks to pay reparations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lotte, and she has you'll see first an agenda related to how the night will go. And a lot of it will be listening and taking in and reflecting. And we'll have some time for breakout rooms, which can be anxiety inducing if you haven't done them before, like, what am I going to say? But please hang in there. They're always the most fruitful and rewarding. So there's nothing to be worried about. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but I'm sure you'll want to. So, and then the chat feature is, you should see a little button at the bottom of your screen, chat. As you have questions during Lotte's presentation, feel free to type them in there. You'll also have a chance to ask them live. But if they come up while she's speaking, feel free to put them in there. Okay, Lotte, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate being here. And Randy, it's great to see you. And the work you're doing is just so important. And I don't know if the rest of you realize how lucky you are to be associated with a really remarkable project, the Reparations Project. These two are doing remarkable work, and it's extremely rare. So I just want to say I'm pleased to be here tonight. I'm pleased to be in such really good company. So thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll hopefully it'll work. You never know when something's going to not go quite the way you expected. So stand by just a second. All right, Sarah, did that work? It worked. Okay, great. All right, well, tonight we're looking at reparations and family history, and trying to envision really what the path to repair is going to look like. And again, my name is Lotte Lieb Dula, and I run reparationsforslavery.com, which is a portal. So we'll be sending you more information about that after the workshop. All right. Can everybody see the agenda also? Just making sure my slide deck is working. Okay, great. So yeah, I'll be doing a 30-minute presentation. Go ahead and if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but we'll do that. We'll answer all of your questions after the presentation. Then if you don't mind, have some paper and pen handy. We're going to do a little writing exercise after this, and then we'll have a breakout session to discuss what we've done in our writing exercise. After that, we'll look at, we'll harvest the group's wisdom. We'll talk about what you discovered about yourselves together, and then Sarah will have some closing comments. All right. I'd like to start just by getting a working definition of reparations on the table. Reparations is really the simple idea that redress is due to African Americans for over 400 years of systemic racism. So that includes 250 years of enslavement, 75 years of legal barriers to Black economic progress, and that's what we'll be talking about, including Black codes and Jim Crow laws. Then another 50 plus years of struggle for civil rights, which just was not ending now. Really, the effects of systemic racism can be felt literally in every area of our lives, from the way we treat land, housing, and transportation, to our health, education systems, basically every area. In fact, racism is embedded in the very fabric of our communities. It's codified in our laws, where almost half of all states still refer to slavery in their constitutions. It's codified in our tax system, where property taxes are actually higher for African Americans neighborhoods, and yet there's still rampant disinvestment in those same neighborhoods in their infrastructure. It shows up as unequal access to resources as simple as food and medicine. It appears in the guise of urban renewal and our freeway systems, which consistently displace communities of color. And it shows up in our history of violence, from the first lynchings to police shootings even yesterday. Now, the reparations movement is really, it's active around the world. Ex-colonial powers across Europe, including Britain and France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, as well as Brazil and the US, are all being called out for their roles in founding and perpetuating the Atlantic slave trade, which, as you likely know, transported as many as 13 million Africans over 400 years to the Americas and the Caribbean. Now, in 2016, the United Nations panel ruled that reparations is due to descendants of enslaved people around the world. Now, the UN defines 5 areas of repair: restitution, which includes restoration of liberty and human rights and the return of property; compensation, which includes restoration of liberty and human rights and the return of property; or compensation for damages, including physical harm, as well as lost opportunities and earnings; rehabilitation from the health and psychological effects of enslavement; satisfaction, which is the cessation of human rights violations and abuses; the establishment of truth-telling commissions; public apologies; and the establishment of sites to commemorate the history of enslavement; and then finally, guarantees of non-repetition, the reforms needed to ensure the prevention of future abuses. Now, in the US, there are really 2 major paths to repair. Now, most African-American reparations groups are pushing for a national program of reparations. This includes goals for passage of a reparations bill, and many of you probably have heard of HR 40, which is created to look at economic redress. Now, this bill has been introduced to the legislature for the last 30 years, but it's remained sidelined. Now, there is some good news. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee will reintroduce it again next year, and currently it's gaining steam and has roughly 170 co-sponsors. Now, the other path to repair involves family and community reparations. Now, these are steps that you and I can take to begin to understand how our family history overlaps with this country's history of enslavement. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. Now, I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about my story and how I came to the path of reparations for slavery. Now, I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm a proud 4th-generation descendant of Colorado pioneers. I'm also a descendant of slaveholders. So I have a very complicated relationship to my genealogy. Now, 10 years ago, if you told me that I'd be supporting reparations, I would never have believed it. As a fiscal conservative, I believed that America was a meritocracy and the playing field was level. Now, I'm sure each of you received the same messages growing up, right? Especially this one. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Now, originally, I had very little interest in American history and even less in genealogy. But in 2015, my mother, Peggy, died, and I took on the mantle she had always worn, that was being the family historian. I'm sure many of you have gone down the same road. I soon began, after she died, I soon began the process of going through 4 generations of family ephemera. It's like 30 boxes worth of stuff. And every box was labeled precious, don't throw out, or family treasure. Anyway, I ended up having nightmares of being buried alive in these boxes. It was crazy. Well, one of the first boxes I opened contained my grandmother, Jeanette Welch's keepsakes. I found all sorts of cool stuff in there. For instance, I was delighted to find photos of my grandmother dressed in costume as Robin Hood. And what fun to page through her 1907 Smith College yearbook and to see her suited up in a Victorian era basketball uniform. I found that she'd belonged to all sorts of quaint social clubs. And it was just thrilling to realize that these experiences formed my grandmother's lifelong passion for the arts, passions I also share. But I also made a discovery that took my breath away. My grandmother had been a member of the KKK social club, as well as the Orangemen. These are 2 groups steeped in hate and racism. My initial joy turned to just terror, honestly. With some trepidation, I started going through my grandfather, William Paxton Carey's things. Now, he'd been a beloved judge, famous for his fairness, Surely there'd be nothing in his belongings to give me pause about my heritage. I hoped anyway. I was amazed to find some mid-19th century daguerreotype photos, and with them a very nondescript looking little black book. I opened it, and I was thrilled to discover that the book belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, William Hayes Paxton. As I paged through the book, I noticed the perfect penmanship and the neat rows of figures, and I thought, wow, this is where I get my business sense from. It appeared to be a business ledger of some sort, but as I paged through the ledger, it became clear that I was looking at inventory records for a Mississippi cotton plantation. I stopped cold as I read the inscription on pages 27 through 30. Loss of slaves by war. Each line had a name, age, and value. My heart froze. I was the descendant of slaveholders. Now, like many descendants, I had no prior knowledge of my family's true history in the South. That history had been conveniently erased, much like the history of slavery has been erased from our textbooks. But here it was, evidence that some of my ancestors had become millionaires in the Mississippi Delta, the majority of their wealth coming not just from their land grants, and they'd received plenty of those, but from the value of human chattel. What's become clear to me is this. As enslaved Africans were effectively building this country, my white ancestors were not only amassing wealth and social advantage, they were building the legal and economic structures that have prevented Black people from amassing wealth themselves. Now, in grade school, we all learned that we, the people, formed the basis of our government. But as I continued my research, it was becoming apparent that we, the people, clearly meant we, the white people. I wanted to figure out how my family fit into this puzzle. So I did a bit of research, and here's what I found. It all started with Elisha Paxton, my third great grandfather. Now, he established a plantation near Lexington, Virginia, beginning around 1815. Now, from the mid-1820s on, Elisha used profits from his plantation to send 6 sons to college. Now, most of them attended Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. At least 4 sons earned law degrees. Then in the early 1830s, several of Elisha's sons, including my second great grandfather, moved to the Mississippi Delta near Vicksburg. There they set up a law practice with their uncle, as well as multiple cotton plantations, the same ones that were detailed in that ledger. Now, this uncle, Alexander McNutt, became governor of Mississippi in 1837. He was a colleague of Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy. Here are pre-Civil War maps of those plantations on Deer Creek near present-day Arcola, Mississippi. Now, most of these plantations eventually went bust, and my second great-grandfather, William, lost his shirt. But this didn't matter because he could still rely on his law practice to earn a living. Now, let's look at one of the adjoining parcels. Bolin Lucas and Jim Collier had both worked the Paxton plantations. Bolin Lucas, as an enslaved man, had been the Paxtons' trusted slave driver, while Jim Collier was a white overseer. After emancipation, they went into business together, bought a nearby parcel, and began farming. Jim Collier soon died. Upon his death, his estranged wife sued for possession of the land. And since Bolin Lucas was illiterate, Jim Collier's wife was able to deceive him and seize his land. All right, let's review the economic progress of white families, including mine, versus the people they enslaved, shall we? My family receives many, many land grants in Virginia, Mississippi, Colorado, at least. I haven't finished my research. Enslaved people can't own land before 1865. Even from 1866 on, when they become eligible to apply for land grants under the Homestead Act, less than 2% of land grants are awarded to freed slaves. My family enslaves Africans to work on their plantations, becoming wealthy since they don't have to pay wages. Enslaved people are sometimes permitted to work side jobs, but as a whole, they're unable to amass any kind of wealth. Even after emancipation, Black codes and Jim Crow laws restrict how much money they can earn and how far they can travel. My family uses its wealth to pay for future generations' private education. Emancipated Africans are mostly illiterate since it's been illegal since 1829 for enslaved people to learn to read or write. After emancipation, they are barred from attending white schools. So with few resources, they have to build their own. Now, despite this extreme hardship, African American families show, as we all know, great resilience. And some manage to amass savings, which they deposit into the Freedmen's Savings Bank when it's established in 1865. Unfortunately, in 1874, Congress mismanages the funds and it goes bust, losing 70,000 families' combined lifetime savings of $3 million, which is the equivalent of $47 million today. This setback has been considered the economic equivalent of enduring another 10 years of enslavement for African American families. My family has another advantage when it comes to the transfer of wealth. Our legal training gives us the ability to draft wills so that our heirs won't have to go through probate. Here's my second great-grandfather's will. You can see here he lists real estate, dwelling houses, lots, and coffin lands. I'm not actually sure what that is. Meanwhile, African Americans have little access to legal services, nor do they trust white lawyers. Many are still illiterate and die without wills, and their property becomes heirs' property, a situation in which all living relatives inherit the property together. Since 1910, as much as 90% of Black-owned land has been lost due to legal treachery as white developers find legal loopholes and grab valuable heirs' property. In fact, that's the situation the Quarterman family is currently battling. So let's look at our friend, the bootstrap argument. As we head into the 20th century, does the playing field seem level to you? All right, well, next, let's look at the effects of programs that catapulted many white families, including my parents, into the middle class. In 1933, we've got the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which aimed to help white farmers by cutting farm production and thus forcing up food prices. However, less production meant less work for thousands of poor Black sharecroppers who lost their rented land and livelihoods. The establishment of the FHA in 1935 and Fannie Mae in 1938 gave white families the ability to finance and insure new homes. But Black families are effectively blocked from these programs due to race-related property covenants. Social Security net was created in 1935 in response to the Great Depression, but by design, many Black workers aren't covered, including farm and domestic workers. About 40% of Black people in the South are excluded. Finally, there's the GI Bill. After World War II, many white families used proceeds from the GI Bill to get an education, start a business, or purchase a home. Now, we know Black veterans are blocked outright from receiving home or business loans, but the same thing happens with the education benefit. Only 20% of Black veterans that apply are accepted into these programs. The result, by the 1950s, many white families have joined the middle class, while most Black families are held back. Today, a Black family's median net worth is just 1/10 that of a white family, and we can easily see why. Authors Derek Hamilton and Trevon Logan put it pretty simply. It was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy and to some extent literal government giveaways that provided whites the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. Let's look at our history one more time. White colonists enslaved Africans for 250 years, inventing the theory of race as an excuse for the subjugation of 4 million people. We amassed profits from this unpaid labor, and then after emancipation, established laws to limit Black movement and economic progress. Now we've conveniently forgotten this history and blame Black people for their lack of economic parity. It's time we look at that bootstrap argument again. Or as Martin Luther King puts it, It's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. All right. We've pinned some of the blame on white people like my enslaved ancestors and the descent and their descendants, i.e. me. But what about immigrants? How do immigrants fit into this puzzle? Well, let's take another look at my family tree, this time on my father's side. My father's great-grandfather, Joseph Lieb, emigrated from Germany in the 1850s with his wife, Anna Maria Zeller-Grotz. Now, they arrived in New York, and he worked for 5 years as a laborer, eventually saving enough money to move to Wisconsin and establishing a farm there. Now, my father grew up hearing rumors that the Lieb's name had been shortened when they arrived in this country, and that they may even have been Jewish. Now, what binds Joseph and Anna Maria with other Northern European immigrants is how they began the assimilation process, or what some racial justice advocates are now calling the process of becoming white. Through this process, Irish, Polish, German, Italian, and other immigrants gradually shed their cultural identities to fit in and work toward achieving the American dream. Many anglicized their names to avoid prejudice, and as was the case in my family, marry into long-established patrician families. What common trait enables them to do this? Being light-skinned. But how do Jewish immigrants fit into this puzzle? Now, this issue is very complex. On the one hand, Jewish people and African Americans are both known for their resilience and accomplishments, despite intense and unrelenting oppression. On the other hand, Jewish people also share some of the benefits many ascribe to whiteness, though not all identify themselves as white. A colleague of mine, British author Thomas Harding, has had a recent experience that perfectly illustrates this paradox. His Jewish ancestors fled Germany, leaving their home to escape Nazi persecution. A few years ago, Thomas was researching his heritage and discovered that the house his family had left near Berlin was still standing. Thomas met with the German family who now lived there. They acknowledged the crime and gave Thomas back his family's historic home. And in fact, Thomas received reparations, much like we're discussing today. Now, this is possible because of the German admission of guilt in the Holocaust, an admission that the US has not made with respect to the crime of 250 years of slavery. More recently, Thomas was researching another line of heritage. In the early 1800s, his family had started one of the largest catering companies in the world. It also happened to sell tea and tobacco. Well, he discovered that much of his family's wealth had come from importing tobacco and other crops grown on Virginia plantations by enslaved Africans. Remarkably, though Thomas was owed reparations on one side of his family, he realized that he himself owed reparations on the other side. So this begs the question, was this an anomaly, or was there a Jewish connection to the slave trade? Unfortunately, there actually is one. Judah Benjamin is a prime example. He was the highest ranking Jewish politician ever appointed in America, and the first not to have to renounce his faith. Unfortunately, he served in various roles in the Confederacy, ultimately serving as the vice president. Also, historians have found that Jewish merchants accounted for perhaps 10% of the slave trade business in the North. Now, many of these merchants were British, like Thomas Harding's ancestors. Also, there's a strong connection with the finance and insurance industries, which have their roots in the slave trade. For instance, the Lehman Brothers started off as cotton brokers and later founded their securities firm investing in the cotton trade. Meanwhile, many other Jewish merchants become wealthy as traders in the textile industry. Historically, the Jewish history of economic success in this country, it's important to review. While victims of oppression themselves, Jewish communities are still able to create economic enclaves that serve to increase prosperity for their families. Now, Black families also established financially independent enclaves in neighborhoods. However, wherever there is Black excellence and prosperity, white supremacists attempt to destroy it. For instance, the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was the largest and wealthiest Black community in the US, with its own banks, school system, public transportation, you name it. Then a white woman accused a Black teenager of touching her inappropriately, and this resulted in the firebombing of the Greenwood neighborhood in 1921 by the federal government. As the 100th anniversary for the Tulsa massacre approaches, their local government has committed to unearthing the mass graves of hundreds of people who were killed there. Great, right? So we've learned that our families' histories in this country are way more complicated than we thought. We've looked at the generation of white wealth, and we've learned that our families likely have some complicity, regardless of our backgrounds or when we arrived here. Now, where do we go with this information? What do we do? Many people find the enormity of this work painful and overwhelming. I know I did when I first gained this knowledge. 3 principles can guide us along the path of repair. First, we need to be fearless in facing both our country's true history, as well as our family's role in it. Next, in this view of history, we need to commit to changing our impact in our communities. Finally, we need to be willing to engage with other white families and with African Americans in this spirit of repair. Now, is this easy work? Well, as Sarah will tell you, and Randy, no, no, this is not easy work. This is difficult. One thing that has really helped me that I want to recommend is I want to encourage you to look within your own family and find a standard bearer for righteous action that you can call upon to be your beacon of hope. Now, this can be an ancestor or a historic figure you admire, really anyone. For me, I call upon my Quaker ancestors who were abolitionists. In fact, Mala and Hayworth operated a stop on the Underground Railroad. So who are the heroes of your family? What did they do? How do their best qualities manifest in you? How can you call on those good qualities to work toward an equitable future for all people? Also, to be able to do this work, we need to cultivate humility. A really powerful place to start is by taking apart and evaluating our origin stories. Now, this is one of the simplest yet most compelling things we can do. For instance, is it really true that we were self-made? Did we start our business or buy our first house without any help? Really? Or did we perhaps have access to some of the very typical benefits like historic land grants, like inheritances, access to financial lending products that African Americans have largely been denied? I designed the Reparations for Slavery portal basically as a roadmap for this very purpose. The portal is designed to take you on a journey from your first questions about the reparations movement through creating a personal plan of repair. In fact, if you do nothing else after this workshop, I recommend you look at 3 sections on the site. I've got an FAQ section that'll answer the most basic questions about reparations. I've got a whole section on understanding the racial wealth gap, which we've looked into briefly tonight. And also there's a section on our stories. So here, the FAQ has probably about 20 different questions that you might be asking. Some of the answers to those questions. Each area of history is in the racial wealth gap section has a section you can find everything from books, podcasts, films, and personal exercises for dealing with these historic lessons. Finally, I think one of the most powerful sections of the website is really reading the stories of other people. I include stories from people of all walks of life and perspectives, but all these people have one thing in common, and that is that they support reparations. Some of the stories have been that you'll read about have been passed down from the slavery era through the many generations. It's really powerful stuff. In closing, I think the most important thing to remember is this. We've looked at economic inequality as the basis for repair, but that's just one element. True repair begins with our families, with right relationship, developing relationships across traditional lines of race and class, and beginning to break down barriers. Developing and deepening these relationships, our racial justice work moves from being merely performative to being truly transformative. And it's in this setting that we can truly work together to remold our world into an equitable place that guarantees freedom and prosperity for everyone. One last thing before we close. I just want to thank everyone for joining Randy and Sarah and working on this project. The relationships that Sarah, you and Randy are developing are just really amazing to me. From working to ensure that the Quarterman's land stays in their family to establishing the Spellman scholarships. I just want to thank everybody for doing this really important work.